So let's get started. Welcome to today's AGE-WELL webinar, Understanding Implementation, Key Considerations around Implementing Technology in Long-Term Care. My name is Alison Schneider, and I am the Education and Training Manager at AGE-WELL, Canada's Technology and Aging Network. I'm really excited to have Sydney here with us today. She is AGE-WELL's Implementation Project Manager, and she's going to lead us in today's discussion. In this discussion, we will explore the various factors that affect technology's integration into existing processes, and we'll specifically focus on important considerations around the 5 phases of technology implementation in long-term care settings and senior living residences. So this presentation will last for about 40 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A to follow. So please post any questions or comments you have for the Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A box. You can also raise your hand during the Q&A session if you want to ask a question verbally. Also, you can enable closed captioning during this session. That's located on the toolbar, and we'll also have a transcript available after the session. We'll also have a recording. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for replay on the AGE-WELL YouTube channel. Okay, so I think that covers my introduction. So without further ado, I will turn things over to our speaker, Sydney, to begin her presentation. Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you, Alison. So I'm really excited to talk to you about implementation today. And a little bit of background about me is that as Alison mentioned, I'm currently a project manager at AGE-WELL with a specialization in implementation. And I joined AGE-WELL in 2021, where I coached senior living centers to implement technology as part of the AGE-TEQ Implementation Response Program. So I'm currently supporting projects in envisAGE, which is an initiative co-led by AGE-WELL and MEDTEQ+, and I'm supporting projects between community organizations and technology developers to integrate and evaluate the implementation of the technology. So before AGE-WELL, I worked at the YMCA as a program manager, which introduced me to program and project implementation. And then I went and joined the Prosperity Project as the operations lead. So I'm currently pursuing my Level 1 Implementation Support Specialist certification from the Center of Implementation. And I also obtained my Master's of Health Science in Translational Research from the University of Toronto, which is a really fancy way of saying that we looked at enacting change through innovations in healthcare. So before we begin, we are meeting virtually, and we encourage you to reflect on the land on which you're located and to consider your relationship to the land and to the people who are the traditional keepers of the land. And we do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. So we respectfully acknowledge that the AGE-WELL Network Office operates on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, which have cared for the land for thousands of years, including Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And we recognize the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which is an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. So as Alison had mentioned, we are Canada's Technology and Aging Network. And as you can see from the slide, we have a very vast network across the country. And this includes older adults and caregivers, international collaborators, member research and research centers, member universities and research centers, highly qualified personnel and trainees, which Alison and Sam at AGE-WELL do an incredible job of fostering our next generation of leaders. We also have our startups and our researchers all engaged in our network. So the focus of today's webinar is on implementation, and this is usually a nonlinear process that typically involves 5 iterative phases. So for those of you who might have come across implementation phases before, sometimes they're 4, sometimes they're 5, but we like to break it out into 5 unique phases. So the first is exploration, where you look at what you're implementing or what the innovation is that you're bringing in. Then we go to planning, where you look at how you're going to do the implementation. After that, you can go into what we call early implementation, which is really a small scale operational phase of your implementation plan. That's followed by a full implementation, which is your full integration phase. And lastly, you have evaluation and sustainability, where you're looking at maintaining the change that you implemented. And as we go through today's webinar and as we talk about these 5 phases of implementation, I do want to preface that I will talk about things sequentially, but these do feed into each other. So there's the continuous feedback loops. You'll be able to see how there's a lot of crossover between these phases and aspects to these phases. And it's not linear as it necessarily has to be when you're doing a presentation. We're also going to talk about the factors that influence implementation success, choosing your implementation team and supports, as well as considerations around sustainability and scalability, as well as planning for those. So starting with factors that affect implementation outcomes. This is an implementation equation that was developed from the Center of Implementation. And they have these 4 elements, and the interplay between these elements impact the outcomes of your implementation. So the way that I've conceptualized this or broken it down is that the what is really looked at during the exploration phase. Your how is during your planning phase. Your enabling context needs to be present throughout all phases. Your implementation quality, it's there throughout all the phases, but it really comes into focus during the implementation phase when actions are starting to be attributed to your plan. And then the significant outcomes are looked at throughout in some aspects, but really at the evaluation and sustainability phase. So these 4 factors need to be planned and consistently maintained throughout the implementation process to achieve your outcomes. Now, we're going to start looking at the phases individually. So starting with project exploration. The exploration phase is a key decision-making phase where the what of the implementation as well as the innovation outcomes are determined. So in order to really start to explore what it is you want to change and the innovation that you want to bring in, it's really important to determine what needs to change. So one really fantastic way to do this is by completing a needs assessment. And we do have a link to this specific one that we're going to share in the chat. So this is a needs assessment toolkit from the Connecticut State Department of Education. However, I do feel that it has a beautiful summary of different elements to a needs assessment that apply also to this sector. So this is also a really, really important phase to start engaging with your stakeholders. And that is in order to be able to highlight what is going well at the site, where the implementation is going to occur, and where there are gaps or areas of improvement. So you're gathering this evidence and really looking at what's going well and where things could be improved. After that, you analyze that evidence in order to identify that site's priority problem. Once you've narrowed it down to that problem, you can start to brainstorm what the factors are that are contributing to that problem. And it's essentially you're starting to develop a problem statement, and you take that problem statement into your root cause analysis. So that is when you're looking at what is the need at the center of that problem. And once you have that, you can start to determine your next steps for improvement, or in this case, you can start to determine a suitable innovation that is going to meet that need and help to address the problem that you've identified. So again, a really important piece to pull stakeholders into so that they can really provide a rich perspective that you might not necessarily have had. So in tandem, while you're doing a needs assessment, it's also very important to do a readiness assessment. So again, we have another link that we're going to share into the chat for you, which is the readiness thinking tool. So having a site that is ready for implementation is an important element in achieving a successful project. So take time to understand your chosen site's context and readiness for change, and identify their strengths and challenges as it relates to the implementation of an innovation. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page when I use a term like context, I'm describing the unique circumstances and factors of the implementation site that influence the outcomes. And it's really important to keep in mind that implementation and context are intertwined and that the site exists within a larger ecosystem. And that ecosystem will exert its own pressures and have its own impacts on the site and that site's specific context. And I do want to mention that even if a site doesn't feel that it's ready for an intervention, especially when you're using a tool like the readiness thinking tool, take time to understand the strengths and the challenges related to implementation, and then you can start to co-develop a plan to address those challenges, building off of the strengths that are already there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about different drivers as well as different implementation facilitators that you can start to pull into those conversations and supporting the site to become ready. So with implementation drivers, there are 3 specifically that I'm going to talk about here. And the first is competency drivers. So these develop, improve, and sustain implementation quality. And they include selecting the right people on the implementation team, training your team to administer and support the innovation, as well as regularly coaching your team throughout the process. So the way that I summarize it is competency drivers relates to people. Next, we have your organizational drivers. So these refer to an environment that welcomes and supports implementation, and it includes having a collaborative and supportive team, processes to collect and share information about how the project's going, and the ability to identify and reduce barriers to facilitate the implementation process. So in summary, it's your environment. And lastly, we have your leadership drivers. So these refer to leadership strategies for different challenges that arise during the implementation process, as well as having supportive leadership. So some of the strategies to help navigate challenges are such things like seeing the bigger picture, identifying what the issues are, as well, and really importantly, is creating a safe environment for discussions to support team members. So in summary, leadership drivers, unsurprisingly, is about leadership. So having people, environment, and leadership considerations are really important for having a site that is ready for an implementation. And related to that are these 10 implementation facilitators. So we'll go very high level through what the 10 are, starting with stakeholder engagement. You are going to think that I'm a broken record by the end of this presentation with how many times I say stakeholder engagement. So very important to have that engagement throughout the project, and not just have them be engaged in the different processes, but move from buy-in to a shared ownership. So there is that real dedication. There's that energy that's there to be able to support the implementation. Next, again, we have supportive leadership. And this also includes having project champions at various levels within an organization. And if it's a few organizations coming together for an innovation implementation, making sure that you have champions represented across those organizations as well. Having appropriate resources from the exploration phase all the way to the sustainability phase is really important, and it's not just about money. It can be human resources. Obviously, financial constraints and financial resources are a very big piece of this and can really limit the ability to bring in innovations. But just think about what the resources are that are required at that site. It's also very important to have dedicated people on the implementation team, as well as appropriate supports for them throughout the process. Planning, which we will go into in a little more detail shortly, it's really important to plan the intervention and the outcomes before you start to action and really bring in the innovation into a site. So providing training and capacity building for this involved stakeholders, I don't necessarily just mean staff with stakeholders in this case. Capacity building for those who are going to be impacted, for those who are going to be using an innovation, for those who are going to be required to change. It's not necessarily just staff. And it's also very important to coach and monitor or mentor your implementation team. So making sure that they have what they need in order to do their role on the implementation team to the best of their ability. Again, supportive environment, making sure that there's that ability for the stakeholders to be able to come and share their feedback and feel like they're involved in the process. Monitoring the implementation process and applying learnings continuously through improvement cycles will also facilitate the implementation through the different phases. And lastly, effective communication. So not just effective communication, but regularly communicating the project's progress to stakeholders to keep them involved and keep them in the loop of what is going on. So now that we're kind of stepping away from context a little bit, we're going to talk about determining an innovation's fit. So in order to determine the fit of an innovation with your chosen site-specific context, you can ask the following questions. So will the need they identified be addressed with the technology innovation? So that's the need that you're distilling down during the needs assessment. Does the innovation fit within the site's community? So looking at things like demographics, workflows, risk tolerances, those elements, that's not all of them, but just to give you an idea. Do they have the capacity to support the integration of the technology? And this is all the way from organization all the way down to individual levels. So being able to break those down and consider them from those different aspects. And does the organization have implementation expertise, or will they need support? And lastly, do they have suitable resources to leverage throughout the implementation? So one way to help you answer these questions is to look to see how the innovation was implemented at other sites. So this could be going to a technology developer and asking them, what their experience was previously, or if you know of sites that have brought in a specific technology or a specific innovation, asking them what their experiences were so that you're able to have an idea of what was done within a specific context and how that compares to the context of your chosen site. Now, we'll talk about adaptations near the end of this presentation as well, but I do want to bring it up here because it's a good practice to start thinking about what could potentially be adapted to improve the fit within your context. And I will say that adaptations to what and or the how are going to happen. And that's just because it is very difficult to take an innovation or a technology off the shelf and be able to do a plug and play where nothing needs to change. So after you've chosen your innovation, which is related to that need that you've identified in the needs assessment, you can think about the potential adaptations to increase fit, whether the adaptations change the effectiveness of the innovation, when to connect with stakeholders, and what would need to remain the same during the implementation, as well as the sustained integration of the technology at the site. So I'm bringing these up as they are important considerations. Whenever you're looking at any adaptations, ask whether the adaptation changes the underlying function of the innovation, and that could impact or change its effectiveness. So when you're looking at adaptations, it's balancing out what needs to change for your site compared to what changes the innovation so much that it's no longer the same thing. So that's that balancing act that you need to do. And this is where talking to your stakeholders to gather their insights, outline the needs to be addressed, and their desired outcomes for the innovation as well. Also looking at articulating the reason for the adaptation and determining what adaptation will be, as well as its impact, are so important because that's when those other perspectives come into play. So getting a more diverse people at the table, really expanding who you consider as a stakeholder to really understand what are the potential ways that you can adapt an innovation or adapt a technology to better fit the context of the implementation site. And then lastly, even though the adaptations are going to happen, again, thinking about what needs to stay the same so that you have that sustained use post-project so that we're not doing another pilot project if that's not the intention of the implementation. Looking to see how can you sustain the change that you've implemented after the project is completed. And then I know I keep talking about engaging your stakeholders, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that here. As you can see on the slide, stakeholder engagement is key to project success. So they influence the project regardless of their involvement level. So keep in mind that their level of involvement is going to change as the implementation progresses. And one way to be able to help you determine engagement levels throughout the project is to use a tool like the stakeholder matrix to determine the level of engagement. So this is just one of many, many tools out there. They all have benefits, they all have limitations. It's really what tools you would like to use to help you be able to conceptualize and understand the stakeholders in your environment, and especially at a specific point in time. So again, thinking outside the box where it's not just staff. So have an example that we've heard recently where occupational therapists can provide key perspectives about the design of an intervention, as well as the implementation of an innovation into senior living environments. So really, thinking about the interdisciplinary teams and individuals that you can bring in to complement your stakeholder group. And then one key piece here is being able to understand stakeholders' perspectives about the innovation. So this actually arises from conflict management, but you don't have to wait for a conflict to arise to start planning out and engaging your stakeholders as a way to kind of mitigate that risk of any conflict. And these aspects, the four that I'm going to talk about, they can be about the status quo, and they can also be about the potential change that's being considered or that's about to be implemented. So you're looking at their values. So what do they care about? Their accountabilities of their commitments behind their ideas, the losses, what do they stand to lose, and the benefits of what do they stand to gain. So keeping those in mind, again, with the status quo as well as the potential change will help to give you an idea of where there could be a little bit of friction or where you might need to spend a little bit more time with that engagement and education piece so that you're not getting into a conflict situation. So moving into phase 2, which is all about planning. This is the phase where you lay out how the implementation, this is the phase where you're going to lay out how you will implement the change and monitor and evaluate the process throughout. So this includes identifying challenges to the change that is required by stakeholders in order to choose appropriate change strategies that address these challenges. So again, I'm going to drive home that stakeholder engagement is key to helping you with this. So determining your how really is about these integration change strategies. And there are 3 behavioral change components to consider. And you'll notice that we shared a link in the chat to a much more comprehensive list for anyone who wants to see more of the research behind this. So the first is capability. And that really deals with how capable do the staff at the site feel. So this is looking at knowledge, skills, memory and decision processes, as well as habits. The next is motivation. So what motivates the staff to change and to sustain that change? And this looks at confidence, social and professional roles and identities, beliefs about consequences, emotions, goals, intentions, reinforcing behaviors, as well as levels of optimism. And lastly, we have opportunity. So what opportunities are staff given to change? So looking at environmental context and resources, as well as social influence or levels of peer pressure within that site. And in this case, peer pressure isn't necessarily a negative thing. It can actually help to have that behavior change happen. So that leads me into developing an implementation plan. And it is critical to develop this plan in order to steer the project, and it needs to be developed before the implementation activities start. So the implementation plan outlines your goals, your integration strategies, timelines, responsibilities, inputs, and as well as outcomes, inputs as well as outputs, risk management strategies, as well as monitoring and reporting processes. So this is just to name a few. If you have a site and you're creating your implementation plan and there are other aspects that you want to include in this, you can mark that down. It's really to create a comprehensive guide of how are you going to do the implementation and how are you going to sustain the change. So for example, we have, in terms of objectives, they can be things like improving social isolation of seniors, reducing wandering occurrences, and relieving administrative burden of frontline staff, just to name a couple. And then you would go through with your team and you would start to fill in this plan until you all come to a consensus of how are you going to implement the change? How are you going to bring in what the innovation is? So it is essential to share the plan with individuals who have active roles in the implementation process. Again, it doesn't necessarily just have to be staff members, and start to think creatively of who could be impacted by that. So, it could be that you're bringing in something that only deals with a specific type of staff at the site. However, another staff type might come in. For example, we've heard of projects with housekeeping, and then the technology gets removed. So thinking through the different people that could be impacted by the innovation that you're bringing in. So now with your implementation team and supports, what I'm going to share with you is a simplified version of the interactive systems framework. And that's a conceptual model that describes 3 interconnected systems. So this is a piece again that we're going to share in the chat with you. So if you wanted to look at the more in-depth model, you're more than welcome to. But we're going to look at our little simplified one here. So behavior change system really deals with the implementation team. And this team is typically comprised of about 3 to 12 people, depending on the complexity of the site as well as the innovation. And they support the implementation of the technology innovation, which means they're the doers. They're the ones that are actively implementing the change. Now, one key piece here is to look to see how you can incorporate diverse experiences, skills, decision-making authority, knowledge, and expertise. So again, you're getting a more wholesome team brought together to provide a lot of different perspectives. You also have your support system. So this also does deal with resources, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the people. So this is looking at your leadership or your team leads, your implementation specialists and coaches, as well as project management type roles. And they support the implementation team. They also have a very in-depth understanding of the identified need, the people that are impacted, and the what and how of the implementation. So they're kind of that go-to support system. And then lastly, we have the synthesis and translation system. In a very simplified way, it's looking at researchers. So they're taking all of this body of knowledge and they're synthesizing it, they're condensing it down, and then they're sharing it with the implementation team as well as with the support system. So they all end up interacting together to promote the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of evidence-based initiatives in real-world settings. So this framework helps people think about the roles in their roles specifically in an implementation system. All right, so with planning for sustainability, sustainability is an active and dynamic process, and the sustainability needs will change over time. So as a result, the integration of an innovation will also change over time. The ultimate goal, however, is to maintain the positive outcomes achieved by the innovation, and that requires sustaining behavior change. So the factors for long-term success, again, there's going to be aspects of this that I've talked about before. They all feed into each other. So the first, unsurprisingly, is people. So looking at their involvement, their skills and capabilities, their leadership, team functioning, and their commitment to the improvement. And that feeds into practice. So we're having robust and adaptable processes, progress monitored for feedback as well as learning, having an evidence of the benefits of the change, and having resources in place. And then lastly, we have the setting. So having alignment with organizational strategies and priorities, alignment with the political and financial environments, and this could be big politics as well as the little politics within the site, and then the support for the improvement within that setting. And that wraps up the planning phase. I know that it's a lot of information and I'm touching on a lot of it very quickly. So I am going to move us into the implementation phases. And I have combined both the small scale and the full implementation together because a lot of the tasks are very, very similar. And we're going to go through those together right now. So with early implementation, it's a big congratulations because you are operationalizing your implementation plan. So during this phase, tasks can include things like managing stakeholder expectations, and this piece can take a lot longer than anticipated. So making sure that you budget time to be able to manage those stakeholders so that, again, we're not reaching a point of conflict. You also will look at testing the innovation in a small-scale, real-life scenario. And this is in order to collect end-user feedback to inform any needed adaptations to the innovation or the integration change strategies. Reviewing the implementation plan and adjusting it as necessary based on the feedback and the real-life scenario that you're seeing unfold as you start to operationalize your plan. It's also really important to review your stakeholders' involvement levels. As I mentioned before, stakeholders' engagement and involvement levels are going to shift depending on what phase you're in. This is also a really great time to continue coaching and mentoring the implementation team, as well as monitoring for implementation quality, and this is to inform any needed adaptations. And a really great way to do this is through cycles of improvement. So things like the Plan, Do, Study, Act are really helpful when they're scheduled at regular intervals to be able to inform what is working well and what can be changed to increase the fit of an innovation being implemented at the site. So again, it's very similar to when you move into full implementation, but during this phase, the innovation becomes integrated fully at the site. So it's no longer a small scale pilot. It is now moved into the scale of which you initially planned. So the tasks are very similar, where you're going to gather your feedback from your stakeholders at regular intervals. You're going to review your implementation plan and make any needed adjustments. Reviewing your stakeholders' involvement levels, because again, as things change, you'll notice that other people start to be incorporated and some stakeholder engagement levels shift. Continue to coach and monitor your implementation team. This is really important that you're continuing to check in with them to make sure that they feel supported in their roles. Monitoring the implementation quality, again, being able to keep your finger on the pulse of any needed adaptations. And that is a really great tool for doing that is through these cycles of improvement. So I know that was short and sweet compared to the first two phases, but those phases do take a lot of time. It's more of repetitive tasks that you're going to continue to do throughout. And it's really about making sure that the implementation is going the way that you anticipated it going. So with that being said, we're going to start looking at evaluation and sustainability. So a very simplistic way to think about the evaluation piece is looking at the needs that you uncovered during your exploration phase and that you had reassessed and reconfirmed throughout the planning, as well as the early and full implementation phases. So you have your needs, they informed the innovation that you brought in, and as you're doing this implementation, the innovation should be coming back and meeting those needs. So it's full circle of the needs inform the innovation meets the needs. Now, after the innovation becomes integrated at your site, it's really important to evaluate whether the innovation met the need you identified during your needs assessment. So to measure the success and the implementation quality, the following types of evaluations can be used. And I know I'm talking about this in phase 5, where we're looking at the evaluation and sustainability, but some of these can be used at different phases in implementation. So the first we're going to talk about is formative. So this is an in-process evaluation where you're looking at how something is being done. And this is used to identify strengths and weaknesses, as well as areas for improvement, by gathering feedback and making improvements as you go. So these usually happen during the earlier phases of implementation. Next, we have process. So you're looking at what was planned versus what actually happened. And this type allows you to compare and inform, or sorry, allows you to compare these two, and it informs the outcome evaluation because it provides context. So doing an outcome evaluation, which we're going to talk about, without doing process, it's harder to be able to say whether or not change happened because of the implementation or because of the integration of an innovation. So the process provides that context. There's also summative, where you're looking at whether or not the project goals were achieved. So this type of evaluation is really helpful to determine whether or not an innovation should be scaled to other areas or to other sites. And then lastly, we have the outcome, or sometimes referred to as an impact evaluation. So you look at how effective the project was and what the impact of the integration of the innovation was. So this is an objective measure of the effectiveness of the change that was implemented, and it usually focuses on a particular group of people. One thing I do want to highlight here is that it's not necessarily the outcome right at the end of the project. It can be, but it's also looking at the impact over time of an intervention or of the integration of an innovation. So it gives you kind of a little bit of a longer lens of how effective or what happened essentially as a result of that integration. And it's really important to plan out your evaluation at the beginning of the implementation process. So this is where you start to think about it when you're writing things down into your implementation plan. And that's why that implementation plan is so critical to guide your project. It's benchmarking, it's allowing you to look back at what you planned for versus what's actually happening, and being able to answer some of these questions with the different evaluation types. So I know I've also mentioned implementation quality a few times, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what this means. So implementation quality really is, are you doing what you said you would? So it's really important that maintaining quality doesn't mean that your implementation plan or innovation cannot change. So this is why it's important to monitor how the implementation is going, for you to be able to make any necessary adjustments to the technology or to the innovation to best fit your site's specific context. And when you're looking at coming up with what it is you're going to be doing, this is when gathering some information about how previous implementations of that innovation or of that technology went, and looking to see what the site's contexts were where that was previously implemented, so that you can make those adjustments. You can figure out what it is that you want to do, so you can communicate that out and try to maintain that implementation quality. So to monitor implementation quality, you can gather feedback from your stakeholders at various points during the implementation phases. Again, it's really important to do that. So performing those regular check-ins to inform those necessary adaptations for the site and the context. And then continuing to support the coaching and mentoring of the implementation team and the stakeholders who are going to be directly involved or directly impacted by the implementation. So to ensure that the innovation aligns with your chosen site, as I mentioned, adaptations are going to happen. And these changes can either be to what people need to do differently, or how individuals, organizations, or systems are being asked to change. So one way to be able to monitor the needed adaptations, they can be worked into meetings through these 5 questions. So how are the adaptations going? Are there any unplanned adaptations needed? If so, what are the reason and why are people making those choices? Will the new adaptations affect the underlying function of the innovation or implementation? And will the new adaptations be addressed in some way? Which then leads me to planning for scaling. So scaling an innovation is an active and complex process to increase the coverage of an innovation. And the actions taken to scale an innovation are dependent on the context of the sites and the technology that's being integrated. So to scale successfully, it's really important to plan for it during the planning phase and gather evidence that the innovation worked to address the identified needs. So it worked as intended. So there are 5 steps to consider when planning for scaling, and I felt that they mapped really nicely to the different phases of, or very similar to the different phases of implementation. So you have your exploration again, where you're looking at the scalability assessment. Then you start to plan, how are you actually going to scale the innovation? The early implementation of the scale-up plan is really preparing to fully scale that innovation at your desired areas or other sites. And then that moves you into your full implementation of your scale-up plan. You're operationalizing at scale that scale-up plan. And then again, you're looking at the evaluation and the maintenance and sustainability of the innovation that you've just scaled. So that leads me to our summaries of what it is that we talked about. I know that it was a lot of information, and I hope that this helps give you some high-level understanding of the different considerations around implementing an innovation within long-term care and senior living environments. So in summary, involve your stakeholders throughout the phases. Budget significant time for the first two phases. Context is key. Regularly gather feedback about how the process is going, regardless of the phase. And then I just wanted to pull up this implementation equation because it does summarize, again, at a very high level, but it does summarize these 4 elements that need to be there. If one's not there, it's really, really challenging to reach those significant outcomes. So you need to make sure that you know what it is that needs to change, what it is the innovation is addressing, how you're going to implement the innovation, making sure that you have a site that's ready for that change, for that implementation, and that it's a supportive, enabling context throughout all of the different phases. Having that implementation quality. So again, are you doing what you said you're going to do? Are you adapting in a way that's effective and improves the fit of an innovation to a specific site? And then that allows you to see whether or not you're reaching those significant outcomes and being able to measure those. So that leads me to the end of my presentation. If you are interested in learning more, or if you do need any help, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to talk to you about this. And that is where I will stop sharing my slide. Oh, Allison, I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay,
Yeah.
great. That was a really great presentation. Thanks so much for putting that together. We have lots of questions already posted, but just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can post your question in the chat. You can post it in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand to ask your question verbally. Okay, so let's get started on some questions. Tons coming in, so always a good sign. Okay. Given how fast technology is moving and how stretched resources are in continuing care, what's the smartest way for organizations to stay ahead without falling behind?
So one of the things that we've heard from a lot of organizations is, and I can't remember the term, I went to a conference and it was the most perfect term to summarize this, but when you're being inundated by all of these new technologies that are coming out, it is overwhelming to stay up to date with all of the products. So I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I could give in terms of this is I would almost focus less on the specific products that are being developed, making sure that you're taking that time to do your needs assessment to understand, it's usually when you're doing your needs assessment, it's not, I'm very much simplifying this, but it's not, we need the latest iPad with these features. It's usually that's a solution that could meet a need. But you're looking to see what the need is, so that need, unless you meet it, it doesn't really change. It might shift in priorities, but if it's not being met, it's not really going to go away. And so that then allows you to take this need and kind of do a little bit of a market scan to see what innovations are out there. We've seen organizations who kind of come up with a grid of these are their must-haves, and then they'll lay out the technologies that are within that technology type or saying that they'll meet that need. And they actually kind of chart it against each other to see, how many boxes are they ticking off with what their absolute must-haves are for a technology. And then that way, if you do that work in advance, when you see these technologies coming across your desk, it gives you something to be able to compare them off of much faster than having to do all of that work from scratch. So I hope that answers your question, Steve. Thank you very much for asking it.
Great, thank you. I think that was a thorough response. When it comes to technology, so this is related to Steve's question, actually. I mean, so much of it has to do with planning, right? What kind of resources, or how would you put a timeline together to implement resources in a long-term care or other home setting?
Well, that's a good question. I know that there's always those cycles of financing, and especially if you're a public or even a nonprofit, you kind of have to use that money. It's kind of that use it or lose it situation. So some ways that we've heard before are, you come up kind of with a short list of you know, what you would love to have, essentially. And so when that decision time opens up and you're allowed to actually start choosing, you already have your shortlist done. I'm not sure. Sorry, does that answer the question, Allison? I'm just trying to think
Yeah,
of
I'm
all the
just
pieces that
thinking
you asked.
like a timeline, and that is related to funding, right? Like
Mhm.
how long does it take? Because it sounds like there are many steps to prepare. There's lots and lots of planning. So you're saying do
Yeah.
that in advance of, say, any money or
Yeah.
resources that become available.
That is a very hard question to give specifics to because it really depends on context. It really depends also on the complexity of, not necessarily the complexity of the need, but the complexity to meet the need. So, if a project is something that's, smaller scale and it's faster to implement and it's less complex, it's much faster to go through all of these phases. Whereas, there could be projects that are 5 years or more in the making. And so it really depends in that way. So I can't really give like an exact answer to that.
The range is great. That's fantastic. Do you have any examples within the Canadian context of long-term care homes uh, of like successful implementation projects? And Jeff specifically asked if there are any AGE-WELL publications that describe successful implementation for technologies that AGE-WELL has developed.
So to answer the second part of that, when I started during the AGE-TEQ implementation response program, that was actually part of a research study. And so it was looking at factors that influence successful implementations. And I know I'm probably not doing that justice, but there is a research paper out there that AGE-WELL was part of that really looked at specifically around like how can implementation coaches help this process. And it was with technologies that are within the AGE-WELL's network. So I can find a link for that. I just don't have it immediately available right now.
Yeah, I'll
And
look
sorry, what
as
was the
well.
first part of the, okay. What was the first part of the question, Allison?
Yeah, the person was asking, are there any Canadian examples, success stories for
Yeah, so
implementation of AGE-TEQ?
yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily just for technology that's within AGE-WELL's network, but I just did recently a workshop with Dani Sinden from Pearly Health. So she had some really great examples of some very positive implementations that they had done with technology. So one of them was the magic table for anyone who is familiar with that. But she has some examples at Pearly Health. As well as I'm going to be doing another workshop coming up in BC. And I am doing that. I'm blanking on his last name right now, but Derek, who is leading Broadmead Care over there, and he loves it. He considers them a sandbox. So technology developers can come in and play and figure things out. And there's that real excitement around supporting innovators. Yes, Derek Bernardo, fantastic person. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk, he this is something that's very exciting for him. I love that I can see the messages popping up. So I also think, just for anyone who knows him, he should run his own podcast. Just like he's that type of person. But Broadmead Care is doing incredible things around technology implementation and innovation and supporting the technology developers. So there are organizations in Canada who are doing that. And who are kind of being leaders in that. You can look at some of the envisAGE projects we're wrapping up, where there's been some very positive outcomes coming out of the technology integration within the community organizations that are participating there. So we're going to be like sharing some of those success stories as well as they come up. So a lot of work is being done. It's just being able to amplify who's doing what and the outcomes that are happening that are not related necessarily to research projects.
Great, thank you. And I did see Dani Sinden was here for Pearly Health, so great that you gave a shout out to them. Yeah, we have that on our YouTube channel as well. If anyone's interested in looking into that video, it is available. Okay, So lots of questions still to come. From Jake. So how do you bring up having formal implementation or technology implementation procedures with organization where those structures do not currently exist? I think your presentation showed the clear benefits of a structured implementation process. And I was wondering, how do you go about helping an organization see the benefits of setting this up?
So that is a very good question, Jake. It's one of those pieces where it relates, in my mind, it relates to how willing an organization is to change. So, it's the difference between having something pushed on you and then pulling something in. So if you're having something pushed on you and you're being told that you have to change because, whatever the reasons are, there's automatically a higher likelihood that you're going to say, or you're going to have pushback against it. Whereas if it's coming from within the organization, so, that might, I know that this is a gap in our sector specifically of, there's very limited information on how do you actually do this? What are proven ways to bring in technology? And so I think it's just at this point, really working and sitting down with people and understanding, where they're at and meeting them where they're at, so that then you could figure out what their strengths are. So really coming back down to that readiness assessment. You need to look to see what they have in place, where their strengths are, where their challenges are, and then start to work with them on ways to be able to address those so that you can bring in a structure, for example, or that you could bring in different ways or different suggestions for them to be able to move forward with integrating the technology. But the challenge is that there's that gap right now in structured approaches.
Great, thank you, Sydney, and thanks for the question, Jake. One of the participants asked to see your penultimate slide again. Would you mind putting that up so that they can see that? That might be the summary slide.
It does have animations, so it's going to be on top of each other, but I'll go through it again. Oh, 1 second. No. Sorry, I have to share my screen at the same time. Okay, Okay. Let me know when you can see this, Allison.
It's coming, yeah. In summary.
Okay. So involving your stakeholders, budgeting sufficient time for the first 2 phases. As we mentioned, this is very context specific, which is why context is key. Regularly gathering your feedback about how the process is going, regardless of the phase, so that doing those continuous feedback cycles is really important. And then I just shared, this is a really wonderful summary equation of all the considerations that need to be in place for you to be able to reach your significant outcomes. So I know that it's unfortunate that I have animations for that because I can't just put it up and have all the information. But yeah, this is, I just thought it was a really nice way to be able to summarize everything that we talked about today.
Great, thanks for resharing that, Sydney. This is being recorded as well, and I'm going to send the links to the recording to everyone in attendance so you can review any of those slides that you missed. So you can always go back and check those out. Okay, so on to another question. Okay, another one from Steve. With limited dollars in continuing care and operators needing to reallocate funds towards technology adoption, how can we ensure that these investments deliver measurable ROIs, driving both sustainability and scalability, rather than only staying as a pilot?
So to me, this is very much about spending time in the first 2 phases, where you're really, I think one of the things that we've heard from different operators is that, it's almost like this fatigue of you're getting inundated, you don't know what to choose, you just kind of choose. Sometimes it's like the newest, hottest technology out on the market, but that doesn't necessarily meet a need that you have. And so then you'll do a pilot and you'll find out it doesn't work for you. So it's really taking that step back, still getting excited about all the technology that's out there, but really stepping back and looking at what your needs are, prioritizing those needs, starting to do that market scan of what's available for you, and then you can start to have those conversations, where you're looking at the finances, you're looking at the constraints, you're looking at what resources have to be there for the implementation to happen. You're able to start comparing what you have and what your capabilities are compared to what the technology is asking of you as an organization. Having your buy-in of residents, of staff, of families, of the technology provider itself, being able to build that excitement up. So you're doing all of this legwork before you even implement anything, but it's really allowing you to come up with key performance indicators and what it is that you want to measure, so that you can in turn have a technology that you have determined meets a need that is prioritized at your site. And then you can start to measure whether or not that technology is meeting it. And again, doing those adaptations to it throughout, so that you're improving that fit. And at the end, being able to present, that return on investment, which can be used then to even bolster an argument for scaling. Especially if you're at a site, if you're only looking at doing one wing of one floor and it's a multi-floored unit or site, or multi-building organization, it can be that start small, build that evidence for it after you've done all that legwork before you move into scaling it up.
Great, thank you for that answer. We have a question that comes from an innovator's perspective, which I think is important to consider, considering our network here is filled with innovators. So from Crystal, Step Scan Technologies offers tech for fall risk assessments, balance and underfoot pressure related to risk for diabetic foot ulcers. So do you think it's better for an innovation company like this one to offer project management or implementation consulting along with their product? Or do LTC facilities prefer to do this themselves?
Crystal, that is a great question. And I think that is very specific and dependent on the site that you're looking to implement at. So, if that's a service offering that you're able to provide additional to you providing your technology, I think that that's a really good value add. There are some sites out there who already have these teams in place, so they don't need as much support because they have that in-house. And there are other sites who don't have the capabilities, they don't have the resources to be able to do that, but they're very willing to get support from third-party vendors. So it really is specific to that site and to the context that they're operating in. But I think, having that thought of how can you better support the sites that you're looking to implement at is a great way to approach this. So if you're able to provide it, it's just, provides an additional service to those organizations.
Great. Thank you, Sydney. Yeah, knowing that context and doing the research. And as Steve said, that it can be highly strategic, right, about what gets implemented. So you have to just keep working with partners and create partnerships, right? And that can be fruitful as someone developing technologies. I mean, entrepreneurs are are familiar with always hustling, so it's part of that dynamic.
Well, and it sets you apart. If you're, if you have a technology and you're willing to do this kind of add-on service, that can set you apart in the market, which is really wonderful. And not all operators out there have that capability. So to me, it's just showing that you really care about getting the implementation done right, in a sense, rather than just giving it to them and letting them figure it out.
Yeah, it can help with the long-term sustainability. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have a couple other questions. These are kind of short ones. Are the implementation phases similar to project cycle phases? So are you familiar with PMI methodology?
I am. It's been a couple of years. So that's actually what I'm pulling up right now, because I have looked at them previously. It is very similar. So, I think implementation, the way that I see it is implementation is a niche of project management. So they are very similar. There are some tools that are very specific to set fields within project management. So not all of those tools are going to be applicable to implementation, and not all implementation tools are going to be applicable the other way. But but it is very similar to the initiation, planning, execution, monitoring and controlling, and closure. So the only difference I would say is that we don't really specify a closure phase, because the way that we're seeing it is it's an integration and sustained use of the technology. So still important to do a closing, having that closure of a project, but that it's less about having kind of a project completed and more looking at the sustained use and the sustained behavior change. So having that celebration of that win, but then also continuing it without it being considered a project at that point.
Great. Thanks so much, Sydney. So I realized I wasn't checking the time. We've actually gone slightly over. So I guess it's time to wrap things up. Thanks to you, Sydney, for an excellent presentation. I'm sure there'll be many rewatches to come. So excited to post that on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much to our audience today. Really great questions, really great interaction in the chat. Thank you so much for coming here to engage. Really appreciate that. And I also put in the chat, our EPIC conference is coming up. So you can learn more about AGE-WELL research, especially coming from trainees, as well as supported startups and partners from AGE-WELL at the EPIC conference, and that's starting May 20th, 30th. So I put that in the chat, and you may register if you're interested. You can attend one or all 8 of the sessions. Okay, so with that, I will close things. Thank you very much again, Sydney, and I hope everyone has an excellent rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone, so much for attending.